let me sneak up to the questions of consciousness a little further. So we usually relate suffering to consciousness. So the capacity to suffer. I think to me that's a really strong sign of consciousness, is a thing that can suffer. How is that useful? Suffering. And like in your model, what you just described, which is indexing of memories and coherence with the perception, with this predictive thing that's going on in the perception. How does suffering relate to any of that? The higher level suffering that humans do.
Basically, pain is a reinforcement signal. Pain is a signal that one part of your brain sends to another part of your brain, or in an abstract sense, part of your mind sends to another part of the mind to regulate its behavior, to tell it the behavior that you're currently exhibiting should be improved. And this is the signal that I tell you to move away from what you're currently doing and push into a different direction. So pain gives you a part of you an impulse to do something differently. But sometimes this doesn't work because the training part of your brain is talking to the wrong region. Or because it has the wrong model of the relationships in the world. Maybe you're mismodeling yourself, or you're mismodeling the relationship of yourself to the world, or you're mismodeling the dynamics of the world. So you're trying to improve something that cannot be improved by generating more pain. Mm-hmm. But the system doesn't have any alternative. So it doesn't get better. What do you do if something doesn't get better and you want it to get better? You increase the strength of the signal. Mm-hmm. And when the signal becomes chronic, when it becomes permanent, without a change inside, this is what we call suffering. And the purpose of consciousness is to deal with contradictions, with things that cannot be resolved. The purpose of consciousness, I think, is similar to a conductor in an orchestra. Mm-hmm. When everything works well, the orchestra doesn't need much of a conductor as long as it's coherent. But when there is a lack of coherence or something is consistently producing disharmony and mismatches, then the conductor becomes alert and interacts with it. So suffering attracts the activity of our consciousness. And the purpose of that is ideally that we bring new layers online, new layers of modeling that are able to create a model of the dysregulation so we can deal with it. Mm. And this means that we typically get higher level consciousness, so to speak, right? We get some consciousness above our pay grade, maybe, if we have some suffering early in our life. Most of the interesting people had trauma early on in their childhood. And trauma means that you are suffering an injury for which the system is not prepared, mm-hmm. which it cannot deal with, which it cannot insulate itself from. So something breaks. And this means that the behavior of the system is permanently disturbed in a way that some mismatch exists now in the regulation, that just by following your impulses, by following the pain in the direction which it hurts, your situation doesn't improve but get worse. Mm-hmm. And so what needs to happen is that you grow up.
Yeah.
That's part that is grown up is able to deal with the part that is stuck in this earlier phase.
Yeah, so it leads to growth, adding extra layers to your cognition. Let me ask you then, because I got to stick on suffering, the ethics of the whole thing. So not our consciousness, but the consciousness of others. You've tweeted, one of my biggest fears is that insects could be conscious. The amount of suffering on Earth would be unthinkable. So when we think of other conscious beings, is suffering a property of consciousness that we're most concerned about? So I'm still thinking about robots, how to make sense of other non-human things that appear to have the depth of experience that humans have. And to me, that means consciousness and the darkest side of that, which is suffering, the capacity to suffer. And so I start thinking, how much responsibility do we have for those other conscious beings? That's where the definition of consciousness becomes most urgent. Like having to come up with a definition of consciousness becomes most urgent. Is who should we and should we not be torturing?
There's no general answer to this. Was Genghis Khan doing anything wrong? It depends, right, on how you look at it.
Well, he he drew a line somewhere where this is us and that's them. It's the circle of empathy. It's like these, we don't have to use the word consciousness, but these are the things that matter to me if they suffer or not. And these are the things that don't matter to me.
Yeah, but when one of his commanders failed him, he broke his spine and let him die in a horrible way. And so in some sense, I think he was indifferent to suffering. Or he was not different in the sense that he didn't see it as useful if he inflicted suffering. But he did not see it as something that had to be avoided. That was not the goal. The question was, how can I use suffering and the infliction of suffering to reach my goals from his perspective?
I see. So like different societies throughout history put different value on the
different individuals, different psyches, right?
But also even the objective of avoiding suffering. Like some societies probably, I mean, this is where like religious belief really helps. That afterlife, that it doesn't matter that you suffer or die. What matters is you suffer honorably, right? So that you enter the afterlife.
It seems to be superstitious to me. Basically beliefs that assert things for which no evidence exists. Are incompatible with sound epistemology. And I don't think that religion has to be superstitious. Otherwise, it should be condemned in all cases.
You're somebody who's saying we live in a dream world. We have zero evidence for anything. So
no, it's not the case. There are limits to what languages can be constructed. Mathematics brings solid evidence for its own structure. And once we have some idea of what languages exist and how a system can learn and what learning itself is in the first place, and so on, we can begin to realize that our intuitions, that we are able to learn about the regularities of the world and minimize surprisal and understand the nature of our own agency to some degree of abstraction. That's not an illusion. So it's a useful approximation.
Just because we live in a dream world doesn't mean mathematics can't give us a consistent glimpse of objective reality.
We can basically distinguish useful encodings from useless encodings. And when we apply our truth-seeking to the world, we know we usually cannot find out whether a certain thing is true. What we typically do is we take the state vector of the universe, separate it into separate objects that interact with each other, so interfaces. Mm-hmm. And this distinction that we are making is not completely arbitrary. It's done to optimize the compression that we can apply to our models of the universe. So we can predict what's happening with our limited resources. In this sense, it's not arbitrary. But the separation of the world into objects that are somehow discrete and interacting with each other is not the true reality, right? Yeah. The boundaries between the objects are projected into the world, not arbitrarily projected, but still, it's only an approximation of what's actually the case. And we sometimes notice that we run into contradictions when we try to understand high-level things like economic aspects of the world and so on, or political aspects or psychological aspects, where we make simplifications and the objects that we are using to separate the world are just one of many possible projections of what's going on. And so it's not, in this postmodernist sense, completely arbitrary and you're free to pick what you want or dismiss what you don't like because it's all stories. No, that's not true. You have to show for every model of how well it predicts the world. So the confidence that you should have in the entities of your models should correspond to the evidence that you have.